Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Dr. DiBiase had mentioned to me that there's a point of emphasis for the students here at Madison High School on World War I this year. So I think that this is something that might be of value to you in terms of some of the projects that you're working on. And at least having an awareness of how Americans were involved prior to the United States entering the actual conflict, I think also has value. And understanding that it wasn't simply a matter of April 1917, the United States declaring war, entering the war. Prior to that, Americans were involved. And Americans here at home were aware that there were Americans that were involved. And certainly Germany was aware that Americans were involved. And they weren't very happy about it, as you can well imagine. So if you could. So France and the United States, one thing that's important to note about the relationship between these countries prior to the war and even during the war was that they were the only two great powers that were republics. All of the other great powers were monarchies of various types. And so this sister republic relationship was something that many Americans were very aware of. There was an historical and ideological tie that was quite strong. Think about what you learned about the American Revolution, for instance, the Marquis de Lafayette, the important role that the French military played, for instance, at the Siege of Yorktown, which was decisive in the United States ultimately winning its independence. Americans were very aware of this. Think about the Statue of Liberty, for instance, which was given as a gift by the French people to the American people. And again, this was an ideological tie that the French were emphasizing as sister republics. France, Paris, many Americans had gone to Paris in the decades prior to the war. This was a period known in European history as the Belle Époque, or beautiful time. It was a time of tremendous creative vitality in Paris, and a number of the Americans that volunteered to serve in the French army in the beginning of the war were either poets, painters, writers, sculptors. Some of them were just sort of roustabouts. There were a few professional boxers as well and musicians. Paris was a place that many of them really found their creative energies, and they thrived there. This is, of course, the Moulin Rouge in Montmartre. Many of them adopted the bohemian lifestyle associated with life in Montmartre and Montparnasse. It was exciting and, again, creative and quite diverse. This is Allan Seger. Seger was a graduate of Harvard, a poet who was really starting to find his voice in 1914 when the war broke out. He becomes in many ways the bard of the American volunteers of 1914. His poems immortalized the contributions that he and his comrades made and tried to convince Americans at home to see the value in the struggle that they were helping wage against Germany. Seger and his comrades, for the most part, saw Germany as representing essentially might makes right. That the Kaiser and his generals and ministers, with the most advanced army in the world and this dynamic economy, were essentially bullying Europe and aiming at hegemony. This is the way they saw it. They saw France essentially as fighting a defensive war in defense of civilization. It comes up again and again and again in the primary source material. What are you fighting for? Well, we're fighting to protect civilization. They didn't necessarily hold it against the German people per se. That's an important distinction. But the German leadership. Bob Scanlan was a friend of Seger, boxer from Mobile, Alabama. In those years, being an African-American man living in the South, it was very difficult to achieve any kind of fulfillment in terms of your life. And Scanlan eventually made his way to Europe, boxed in London and Paris, and eventually, because of the very tolerant attitude in France towards race, he embraced the city and it embraced him. And when the war broke out, he joined. William Thaws on the right, he was a playboy from Yale, came from a super wealthy family. The one thing he took seriously was aviation. He was a stunt pilot. This is actually after he had completed, along with his co-pilot, a stunt where they flew under the then 4 bridges that span the East River. You know, the Brooklyn, Manhattan, Williamsburg, and Queensboro bridges. He made a name for himself. He was in France actually competing in an air show, an air contest in the south of France when war broke out, and he decided to join. The Kaiser von Moltke, his chief of staff. Germany, one of the things that I'm sure that you've probably studied or will study is the causes of the war. A lot of time, a lot of ink's been spent on this. My view, and I know I'm not alone in this, is essentially that Germany was looking for a war. That they essentially piggybacked, if you will, their war on Austria's war against Serbia. Austria also was looking for a war. They saw the war against Serbia as preventative and preemptive. Germany also was fighting what they saw as a preventative and preemptive war against what they saw as the encirclement by Russia and France. They were worried that by 1920, Russia, with its military buildup, would be very difficult for them to beat. And so they were looking for an opportunity, and then this sort of opportunity fell into their lap of the assassination. And by backing Austria, their ally, that gave them cover for something that they wanted to do anyway. Fritz Fischer, if you're looking for a historian that you can cite, look at Fritz Fischer's work on this. He had access to the old imperial archives in Potsdam during the Cold War that were not unavailable to a lot of Western historians at the time. And his work was really influential in changing a lot of people's views about the war, which immediately after the war, the consensus became essentially that no one country was really responsible. The evidence does not really support that anymore. Hems Cathedral in Champagne. The German destruction in Belgium and France was extensive and systematic. There are parts of that, of France, that still bear the scars. This is important to keep that in mind, that a large part of France was a war zone. Some of the most economically important, also fertile territory was lost to France, and it took years for it to recover. Civilians lost their homes, their lives, they were orphans. It was really quite sad, and I think a lot of times that's not emphasized enough. The refugees. The Americans were very aware of this because a lot of times they saw it. They were on their way to a battle and going the other direction was the flotsam and jetsam of war, the refugees. This is as the Americans went off to the Gare de Saint-Lazare, the train station in the west of Paris, to board a train to Rouen and join the Foreign Legion. They joined the Foreign Legion because it was the only unit that would take Americans without the Americans having to renounce their citizenship. The Foreign Legion, even then, has a bit of a dark mystique. Most of the people that were in it because they didn't have many other options. It was a very rough crowd, polyglot, diverse. It took time, but eventually the Americans came to respect their comrades, and their comrades came to respect them. And most of that occurred on the battlefield. The Foreign Legion, because it was attached to what was called the Moroccan Division, which was known as an attacking unit, it wasn't used on defense, were in some of the most horrific fighting in the war. Now, Thaws, Champagne, Verdun, the Somme. Though in Verdun, it was actually the Americans were attached to a different. Some of the Americans were attached to a different unit, but Artois, Champagne, and the Somme, and it was because they were in the Foreign Legion. Here in France, just to give you a sense of it, Paris, of course, was where they joined. Many of them were living in Paris when the war broke out. If you go to France and you want to visit the battle sites, it's essentially in sort of an arc between where you see Arras and Artois, this is where Vimy Ridge is, through Picardy, and then into Champagne, and then here in Lorraine, where Verdun, which is where the largest battle of the war took place. This is Canel in Picardy, a little village. The destruction there was so great. This is where the Americans were initially stationed. It was along a ridge called the Chemin des Dames. I've been there. There's a village there, but the village is not the village that was there. The village was literally rebuilt some ways away because the destruction was so great there was no point in rebuilding. So they in the exact spot. So they had literally rebuilt elsewhere. This is the Chateau de Blanc de Blanc. This was a beautiful chateau that had been bombed by the Germans, retaken by the French, and the Americans were stationed here in their first winter of the war, 1914-1915. To the left is Kiffin Rockwell. Rockwell was the grandson of a Confederate War veteran. He had attended school at VMI in Washington and Lee. He was an idealistic young man from Atlanta. He was working in an ad agency, and he and his brother were not in France, but they booked passage to France and volunteered for the Foreign Legion. And Rockwell was a really formidable character, a real warrior in the truest sense. And he eventually became a pilot, one of the founding pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, which was a famous American squadron that flew in the French Air Force. This is Paul Nash's famous painting of No Man's Land. He was an English veteran and painter. To give you a sense of both the ugliness, the alienation, the dehumanization, it's hard to even find the human figures. You have to look very carefully. Ugliness. These battlefields, for instance, if you go to Verdun today, you'll be moved by the graves and the ossuaries. It's hard not to be. But it's hard to get a real sense of what it looked like because the destruction was so complete. Today it's just rolling green hills and there's trees. At that time it was just a cratered fields and hills just of mud and corpses. You had to live with the mud. You had to live with the smell of death all of the time. This is something that never makes it into books. But this was something that, in my research, was something that came up quite a bit. Getting used to eating a sandwich next to a decomposing corpse. I don't know about you, but I could not imagine doing that. But you had to, because there was nowhere to go. This is Kiffin Rockwell with the pool cue. Again, the southerner who was working at the ad agency, became a pilot. Victor Chapman, who was from the Hudson Valley here in New York, he's talking to the matron of this, it was actually a restaurant, the Hotel Palme d'Eau. This is when they were training to become pilots. The idea of becoming pilots was really exciting. It was a new field. It also was something that hopefully would get Americans' imagination, or capture their imagination in a way that fighting in the trenches, people couldn't grasp that. But pilots, you know, with the colorful insignia and the sort of knights of the air, that's something the press could seize on. And the French were very aware of this because the French were hoping that the United States would come into the fight. And if you could, you know, have these images of these dashing pilots fighting the Germans, that might develop sympathy for the French cause. Chapman again. Chapman was an artist, a gentle soul. He really should have been, in my opinion, working in the ambulance corps. He was much more inclined to save lives than take them. He was an idealist. Some of his accounts of flying, just some of those beautiful words I've ever seen written about aviation. He and Rockwell were quite close. He was one of these people that was serving in the trenches. He was in the Somme sector. It was so deadening for him. Artists in particular were deeply affected by having to serve in the trenches. The ugliness really had an effect on them in a way that perhaps it didn't on others. Here are the pilots, Chapman, Rockwell to the left, Chapman on the right. There, among others, you can't quite see some of the others. This is McConnell and Hall, Prince. This was the founding members of the squadron and their French commanders. And they acquitted themselves quite well. Initially, it was sort of a flying publicity stunt, but they became a formidable fighting unit. This is the planes that they flew initially. It was nicknamed the Bébé. The Newport number 11 was a French-made aircraft, highly maneuverable. dangerous to fly because it was so maneuverable. I mean, just you could never relax. I've talked to pilots that fly these aircraft that have been maintained, and they talk about it, that it's one of these planes that is so maneuverable that you just cannot relax for a second. But it gave them an advantage against the Germans, who outgunned them in the air. But the maneuverability enabled them to win many victories in the air. This is a stage photograph, actually, later of a dogfight, but just to give you some sense of what a dogfight would look like. This is when you had a sort of a general melee between planes all at once. As you can imagine, it was confusing and terrifying, and it was also one of the things about flying too that's worth mentioning. It was very cold. These were open cockpit. Even in the warmer months, it was cold, but then you can well imagine when it got, when it was the winter, brutally cold. And the air was quite thin when you got up high, and there was no pressurized cabin and so forth. Woodrow Wilson, I know you're probably spending some time on Wilson. Wilson was somebody who was not very popular with the Americans who had joined the French army. Most of them looked to Theodore Roosevelt. They'd grown up in an America where Roosevelt had been president. They admired him. Roosevelt had taken a stand in favor of intervention, as you're probably aware. He was very vocal about it. They couldn't understand that Wilson could not see what they saw. But Wilson, you have to understand, was on very strong historical ground, in that the United States, going back to Washington's farewell address, which I'm sure you're aware of, had taken a non-intervention stance towards European affairs. So he was on firm footing and not wanting the United States to get involved. He also was a Southerner, which a lot of times people forget because we associate him with Princeton University, but that was only later in his academic career. He was Virginian. And he, as a boy, had experienced the Civil War, and he was not eager to get the United States into a war. But eventually events forced his hand. Here's Kiffin Rockwell again, the pilot who was one of the leading figures in the Lafayette Escadrille. I don't want to give away too much of the story, so I won't tell you what happens to these figures. Yeah. Bob Subidon, he was a race car driver from Ohio. You see the Indian Head logo. This was on the 103rd Pursuit Squadron. They adopted the Lafayette Escadrille's logo when they were formed once the U.S. joined the war. The pilots were warmly welcomed into the U.S. Army. They wanted their skills. Those that had not become pilots were actually the ones that were still alive. The U.S. Army basically said politely, no, thank you. They felt that the French had thrown away the lives of millions of men, and what the Americans had learned wasn't really going to be of value. They were quite bitter about it. But the pilots, because of their skill set, were welcome. And here's William Thaw at the end, really influential figure in the founding of what became the U.S. Air Force in terms of its methods. He was, again, the Playboy stunt pilot who had joined up in the beginning of the war and served in the trenches. This is the memorial at Mont-sur-Coquette to the west of Paris. If you ever go to Paris, you can get a commuter train out there. It's a really pretty village, suburb. To give you a sense, look at the monument, the grandiosity of this. It's really quite something. The French are very aware of the American contribution in World War I. I can't emphasize that enough. I had people thanking me. Thank you. It was pretty awkward because I had done nothing, of course. But it really struck home to me. They are very aware. Also, they're very aware of their World War I history. It's very important to them. These sites are well maintained. People are knowledgeable, gracious, generous. It's very similar, I think, to the way that the Civil War, that role that plays in our history and our society, and how people are very interested in maintaining that. And lastly, this is the memorial in the 16th arrondissement in Paris. This is modeled on Allan Seger, the poet. The memorial to all of the American volunteers, not just the pilots, who served and who were killed. Seger wrote the poem Rendezvous with Death, which again it gives the title to my book. It's quite famous, and he was killed in the assault on Belleuil-en-Santerre on the 4th of July in 1916. And he's someone that is greatly admired by the French people even today. Interestingly enough, a side story about Seger, his brother was Charles Seger, who was a professor at Cal Berkeley, and he came out strongly against the war and actually got fired from his position. So the brothers disagreed strongly about this. And his brother's wife was pregnant at the time with Pete Seger, who became the folk singer and activist, labor activist, anti-war activist later in the 20th century. So it was quite a remarkable family. They definitely had convictions, though those convictions might be different. So I'd like to take any questions that you have about the book, the war, American intervention. Yes? About the war, about the United States. The German people were exhausted by the end of the war because their economy had been geared towards the army, helping the army. And so there was a sense of relief in many ways that the war was over, particularly if you had a loved one that was coming home. But there was also disillusionment with Woodrow Wilson, because many of them felt that Woodrow Wilson was going to be their champion in the negotiations, and that there would be a peace without victors, which is something that Wilson had explicitly referenced. But Wilson, over time, adopted the views of his allies, his negotiating partners, Clemenceau and Lloyd George. And the peace that was imposed on Germany made a lot of the German people quite bitter. And a lot of the veterans felt that they hadn't really been defeated because they had withdrawn in good order from French soil, not German soil, and come home. If the war had continued into 1919, that scenario would have been quite different. Germany was on the verge of collapse. But because the war was ended when it did, it lent credibility to the myth that Germany never lost the war. And that in turn leads to the rise of the political movement that Adolf Hitler led. So it was quite momentous that the way the war ended and how the peace ultimately was settled. One of the things I address in my book is that I think that Wilson made a big mistake in going there personally and negotiating. He also alienated the Republican Party, who had just won majority in Congress in the midterm elections, by not including them. I argue that he should have sent the chief Republican foreign policy expert, Henry Cabot Lodge, to Paris to negotiate, and only shown up, at the end to sort of be there for the ceremony. Now, he would have had to share credit, but then he also would have had someone, first of all, who was more capable, and second, who he could have blamed if things went wrong. But he was a self-righteous kind of guy. He was the son of a minister. He was a professor. He was used to talking at people. That didn't work very well when you're dealing with other world leaders. He was out of his depth. Yes?
Where and when was the Battle of Argonne Forest? Can you provide a brief description of it?
The Meuse-Argonne was it's to the northeast of Paris. It was a sector that the Germans had held for quite some time, and the Americans launched an offensive there. It was the only great offensive that the Americans launched in the entire war. It took place over a period of about 6-7 weeks, and it was incredibly deadly because the Germans, again, had been there for a long time and had set up all kinds of nasty surprises for anyone who tried to take it. The Americans eventually won the battle, if you want to call it a battle. It was really a long series of engagements over a wide area. But they lost so many men in doing it that it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, in the sense that, winning those kinds of battles or engagements, is it really worth all that cost? It was a hard lesson for the Americans, because the Americans came thinking that they had the answers, and they were a bit smug. And they had to learn the hard way the lessons that their allies had to learn. I will say this, though, by the time the Meuse-Argonne offensive happened, arguably it really wasn't necessary. Not that the Americans or their allies even realized that, but looking back now, the key American contributions were earlier in the summer, particularly in the Battle of Soissons, which today is lumped together with a series of other engagements, and they call it the Second Battle of the Marne, which in many ways it takes away from the importance of the Battle of Soissons. That attack, which was the combined French and American assault on the Germans as they were trying to capture Paris, was what really broke the German offensive in 1918. The British like to take credit for a few weeks later their gains at Amiens being the difference. But by that time, the German staff had already, high command had already made up their minds essentially to withdraw in order and try to get the best deal that they could. Good luck with your projects.